So, as I mentioned, this is my talk, Vibing Your Way Through an Enterprise, how attackers are becoming more sneaky. A bit about myself before we get right into it. My name is Matthew Eidelberg. I'm a senior security consultant in Optiv's attack and penetration team. My roles in this team are to primarily carry out red team engagements, social engineering campaigns, including both tailgating, pre-texting, as well as email campaigns, as well as carrying out targeted internal and external penetration tests and physical breach assessments. A lot of the information we're going to be discussing here is coming from years of experience doing these types of engagements, as well as my own research. So this is a great analogy to describe kind of the traditional defenses in place and how they're not really that effective against the modern attacks that we are seeing over and over again through various different things: nation-state actors, internal threats, corporate espionage. And the reason is because these defenses are great at stopping and detecting what they know or what they've been programmed to look for. But attackers can deviate by just changing, modification, obfuscation, modifying headers, doing anything like that. And these same payloads, these attack techniques, slip right through the sieve. And part of the problem is that companies need to start realizing that it's a matter of if, sorry, it's a matter of when, not if, their company is going to be breached. Oftentimes, companies don't realize they've been breached until it's public news, some information that shouldn't shows up on public sites like Pastebin or anything like that, and then reaction happens. So to be proactive is one of the key things, and it's also one of the hardest things. The sad truth is that attackers will always get in. We know that spear phishes work really well. Anyone who works in a corporate environment, you're inundated with tons of emails, benefits enrollment, gotta click this, gotta go here. And these types of spear phishes, we can coerce users to either click on a link to download and execute a payload, thus giving us access into the environment, disclose credentials through maybe a portal or some kind of other social engineering technique, or essentially just expose a company to unnecessary security risk. Other things, very common, and it's always one of the hardest hurdles we hear about and work with clients, is weak passwords. So companies are always inundated and have this huge problem with trying to find a balance between what a user can do to enter in a password, complexity-wise and length, and what can't be guessed. So I'm going to start off by asking, who here, you don't have to raise your hand or anything like that, I don't want the information, but in your head, who here knows their company's password policy? And how many of them would say that the password, when you looked at it, would be a minimum of 8 characters, and it uses Microsoft's complex option? Does anyone know what that complex option actually does? It just mandates 2 things. The password has to be 7 to 14 characters, if I'm not mistaken. Feel free to correct me, but I believe it's 14. And it has to contain contain 3 out of 4 things: capitals, lowercase characters, a number, or a special character. So great examples that meet these complexities. Winter 2018 has a capital for the W, lowercase for the rest of the word winter. 2018, that's 3, and it's more than 7. How easy is that to predict? Pretty easy. And a lot of companies fall prey to this. And of course, the more complex, the more sexy thing is new exploits, 0 days that are released that expose a company to unnecessary risk. Examples, we see this a lot. We all read the news of Apache Struts, Eternal Blue. But companies still are plagued by MS-8067, a vulnerability that was released 10 years ago. So they're going to get in. And once they're in, they're going to perform a series of techniques to move throughout the network. This is known as lateral movement. So lateral movement is a series of techniques where an attacker is going to move throughout a network with the goal of either compromising the entire domain, maybe accessing some of the sensitive business data, such as trade secrets, credit card information. If you're a medical company, it could be as simple as patient records. But this is, they have a goal. And for them, moving throughout this, they have to figure out the best way, the shortest path to get to this goal. These techniques often use credentials. And the biggest thing is that they're not using like exploits. It's really simple. You can acquire or compromise other credentials to move throughout the network. And that's the typical modus operandi. They go from one user to another user with the guise that they have higher privileges until they get whatever they need. And these techniques that they abuse are actually not really bugs or flaws in an environment. These are actually Windows administrative features or business-related ones that allow users to perform their tasks, or IT admins to administrate these machines. And this can be a great example, WMI. It's built into Windows. It has a robust amount of features to allow network administrators the ability to assess remotely services, processes running, maybe even create services, bat files to do specific tasks. An attacker can do the same thing, but with a very malicious intent. And it's really hard for system administrators to just disable these without crippling their business's ability to function. So when I talk about lateral movement, I like to talk about it in 3 phases. You have your domain reconnaissance, your compromise phase, and your credential theft. This is like a rinse and repeat as it goes through until an adversary or attacker is successful. A lot of research, talks, development have always gone into compromising credential theft, where if you're all familiar with the PS exec, Cobalt Strike, utilizing a lot of these techniques, Mimikatz, or even PowerShell, PS attack, all these types of power-up tools. A lot of these focus on those 2. This type of talk is really going to be focusing more on the domain reconnaissance side because it's crucial and so important for an attacker to know where they need to go. They need to formulate a plan. They can't go in there blind. So what is domain reconnaissance in a nutshell? It's the act of learning what users exist, what groups, computers, who belongs to what group, what are those groups' role and functions, what does it give you access to, what is the intended purpose of this group, what tasks are running in the environment, what systems, who has read privileges, who has write, who's remotely logged in on what. Using this information, an attacker can quickly figure out where they need to go to get elevated privileges. Maybe they need to get domain administrative rights, as we like to call it, the key. Once you have administrative rights, any box, any service you can open, you're good to go. So, I jumped ahead. So what I just described kind of relates to this slide. So this is a great example of what it would look like. You see you have a computer that's been compromised, possibly through a spearfish or some kind of malicious attack scenario. And from there, the adversary is learning through net commands who is in maybe a particular group, like net group, domain admins, who's in there, what shares are available, where they have access, who's currently logged in. So why do we care about domain reconnaissance? So it's often overlooked. I mentioned before that there's been a lot of research and focus on the other 2 phases. But if a defender or a blue team's ability to detect these types of activities right off the bat, and they can systematically create a timeline to figure out where and how they got in, they can shut down these adversaries before they get further in. And that really plays to this new philosophy defense has been adapting over the past few years, which is called assume breach. So assume breach is a concept and a practice where you've just accepted that you're always breached. You're 24/7, you're under fire. And this mentality changes how you fortify and maybe invest in your security. If you know that somehow someone's going to get in, maybe you're not going to invest so much on hardening your perimeter, but you're going to worry about what's on the inside. So there's always been this concept of hardened shell, GUI inside. And we're looking at that GUI inside and really trying to harden that up, focusing on how to mitigate and cut off an attacker before they get to wherever they want to. So Assume Breach looks at 4 different things: how to detect the threat, how to respond to it, how to mitigate any data loss or leakage or tampering, and then creating rules and hardening procedures to prevent this type of attack chain from happening again. Now, there are tools. We all love our tools. There's appliances. Network behavioral ones are the biggest ones in this type of niche field. And they focus on looking at not only signature-based events, but also characteristics. And what that means is we're all familiar with what a signature base is. If it has looks like it's a Metasploit payload, and it calls out, or something along those lines that meets a certain criteria, that could be flagged as malicious. But characteristics are looking at a baseline in your environment. So they take lots of data and look at how each of your users integrate. So let's just say Sally from HR. She always comes in 9 to 5, works on her machine, accesses 2 applications. Once a month, she uploads some new stuff through an RDP session. OK, that's been her job for 2 years. One night, she logs in at 9 p.m., starts sending erroneous commands, looking to see who's in what group, looking at certain file systems, starts requesting IT shares. Well, that's out of her norm. That's out of her purview. So right there, those types of different characteristics. This user's logging in at a different time. She's requesting different stuff. This is all suspicious. And a lot of these activities relate to what an attacker would do if they were to compromise. So these tools, I'll show you an example. So here's an example of just command prompt, looking to see what privileges, who's in what group. These tools can detect and analyze what user, what machine, what commands. And from that point, you can start your timeline of events to see your indicators of compromise. And those are what led to the compromise, how are they moving along, where are they going, what are they looking for? Because if you know where they're going, you can stop them before they get there. Another example, powerful tool, looking for sessions. This one, you see who's logged in. That way, if you need to get a specific user, you can compromise that user because they're on that box. If you have access to that box, you can compromise their credentials, hijack their session. So that type of reconnaissance can be detected. You can see what machine this request is coming from, what information was leaked, so you better understand. Another example, using PowerShell. Same sort of thing. We're able to see who, where, and what information they were able to gather. These tools also have a great functionality, like I mentioned before, about timelines. It's very important to understand how they're moving through, when did they get compromised, to create a timeline of events, to know what they've touched, what they've compromised. And so you can see right here in this example, you can see who's touching what machine, who's accessing what resources. And it's very important to understand, maybe by looking at this, where they're going. So with this paradigm shift in the environments, attackers have to become more clever or stealthy. Attack these types of network behavioral analytics softwares have made it a huge hurdle and a pain for breach simulation, red teamers, or even nation-state actors from performing post-decks and before they get lopped off. So attackers are moving towards a philosophy of living off the land, where they're not using things like command prompt or PowerShell or tools. They want to try to use what resources are built into the environment. And one of the most common one that's often overlooked from both attackers and sys administrators is LDAP. So LDAP is a protocol that really integrates well with Active Directory. It pulls on the same type of information. It's designed as a hierarchy-based platform, so you can understand and essentially pull down the same information you would just by simply going net user blah 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 group or net user whatever you need to. But one of the big features and why it's commonly used in a domain is because there are a lot of non-Windows-based machines. These could be Linux environments, PCI segmented environments that are not Windows-based. Even printers, they need to be able to coordinate. A lot of things, I'm sure we're all familiar here. Show of hands who's ever seen those YouTube videos from HP about the wolf. Okay, definitely take a look at those. They're quite funny. Christian Slater being his old hacker, Mr. Robot, advertising this next-gen printer security. But they still need to be able to verify what users and who can print. How do they do that? Can't join it to a domain, so they use LDAP. So why am I talking about LDAP? It's because it's really hard to detect malicious activity going on when LDAP is involved. And the reason for that is, once an authentication occurs, that's the only event that's ever generated or logged. You can't see through an event log what is being requested or what is being pulled down. At the most, if they're using an unsecure, so they're not using any encryption, you can see by basically monitoring the traffic in that local range what data is coming across in clear text. But attackers, obviously, it's very simple. Encrypt it, can't see it. Can't see it, you can't trigger an alert. Here's a kind of a diagram. You can see you have on the left a compromised box doing the same type of network commands built into Windows, just trying to understand the lay of the land. Those logs then get forwarded to a security monitoring center, which generates an alert, and your team begins their IR process or whatever procedures. On the right, you can see there's a TLS-based connection to a domain controller, at which point this information is pulled down locally, and they can just query it on their end. So none of those logs are ever generated. There's none of these net commands, none of that stuff. The same information is being able to be viewed and accessed, but nothing is being sent to the security center. Therefore, no events are being triggered. The other big thing is network Windows APIs. So these libraries are becoming more and more popular for adversaries to use because they're on every Windows machine. They provide a sleuth of functionality and features. And one of the key things is that it makes their traffic look benign, and it makes defenders' job nearly impossible to detect between malicious and normal activity by using the features and APIs that are built into each Windows box. So I'm going to talk about a few of them that are commonly used and that we use and we've seen. The first one is Net API. So this NetShare API. So this API essentially reviews and pulls down information related to remote shares. This information is garnered by 5 different levels, and you request that level with each request. You can go from just basic the name, description, privileges, the user you're requesting it as has access, who's currently looking at it. But those higher levels require additional privileges. However, the first 2, 0 and 1, they don't actually require anything besides valid credentials. You could be a low-level user, maybe a contractor even, and still pull down this information. With this information, then they can figure out, okay, which shares are involved. And then the next step is to figure out what access they have. So you would enumerate this access by looking to see what read-write commands you have. So read is quite obvious. You just try to, using the API, do a read request to see if you can read any data from that share. If you're successful, you know you have read data. When it comes down to write, it's a bit more tricky. And we all know that because endpoint solutions, AVs, they're getting more advanced with regards to how they're detecting files being written to disk. They know signatures of files, as well as any malicious payload, any techniques. If a file is written to a certain place and then is called subsequently, that could be an indication of a WMI exec or what have you. There's a lot of different ways. However, a folder, you can write a folder, requires the same privileges as a file to drop to disk. But a folder has no size, it has no bit length, there's no data in a folder besides its name. So it's really hard for those AVs and endpoint solutions to detect a folder being created instead of a file. The second one is it's the workstation user enumeration. That name, you can try to pronounce it, good luck. I have never been able to successfully from talking to a lot of Microsoft vendors. This API is designed to pull down all active users' information. So who's logged in, who has an active session, an RDP. It does this by whenever someone connects, it creates a user token. This token can then be read by this API remotely. The only caveat is you have to have administrative privileges on the box to see all this information. The reason why I bring this up is for its more commonly used and known API, NetSession Enumeration. So it functions the same way, where you can pull down the same level of information. The difference is you don't need to have elevated privileges or admin rights on the box. You can be any user so long as they're valid domain users. This API is more commonly used, and the reason why I left it for last is because there's a lot of problems with it. It is most commonly abused. Lots of tool suites use this. It's kind of, like we like to say, a little dirty to use because it's so easy to detect. And a lot of teams just write generic profiles or alerts if this is ever called, and then they try to eliminate the ones that are legit, hoping that half the time there will probably be false positives, but maybe that one or few times they'll get a hit of something malicious. So with that little bit of information, how do attackers go around it? They use a combination of the first two. They look at reading the C drive to see if who's been logged in, look at the profiles. If they have administrative rights, they'll try the workstation administrative one. And if they have write access, they'll drop a file and remotely execute it, because if you have write access to C$ or admin $, you have the ability to execute commands, and you're also an administrator. So with all this information, let's talk about Vibe. So Vibe is a tool I created. It's a framework where you can perform all these tasks we just talked about by pulling down through LDAP without being detected all this information about the groups, the users, the systems, perform the same type of net-based commands you would do through CMD or domain reconnaissance using PowerShell without being caught. The other caveat is you can perform additional queries and advanced lookups, as well as look to see what shares and permissions you have. And if you have elevated privileges, it will let you know what sessions, who's logged in. This tool uses no PowerShell, and we've tested it against numerous systems and vendors without being caught. So I've been talking for a while, so let me just show you a demonstration. So you can see that right now what we're doing is we're pulling down the contents of the domain. We're pulling down all the users, the workstations, and the groups, and the affiliations, and all the information. You can see that right here displayed. You can pull down it pulls down every single group's computers and users' profile. So any single thing that is stored or in AD, it pulls down. You can see right here, here are the computers. You can see what version. I know it looks a little blurry on my end as well. What I'll do is I'll post this video online, so that way it might be clearer. And we can also see the file systems that are associated. So which file systems have tons of data. So this information is pulled down passively through Active Directory, looking to see which ones are mapped drives, profile paths are stored. We can also perform the same net commands. So if you're familiar with net commands, you can perform these net user blah, and it will still execute the same information, display it all for you, and you're never touching the environment. So none of this traffic is ever leaving outside of your team server, your C2 environment. You can add multiple credentials as you harvest more and more. That way, as you get elevated and get more privileges in the environment, you can change your tactics and start looking to see who, where, and what they have access to. So right here, we're going to see where this user has access to. We're going to look first at the shares. This function also has a jitter and a sleep function, so the way you can obfuscate and kind of control based on your beacon, your session. Also, that way you're not hitting them sequentially. It randomizes each request, so that way it's not like 192.168.1, 192.168.2, It doesn't go down. It randomizes it, so it makes it really hard for blue teams to kind of create these signatures that we've been talking about. So once we've found out that we have privileges, you can see right here, we can see who's logged in. I know it's a little blurry, but we can see who's logged in and what permission and users have created profiles. So once we've added those new credentials in, we can then see what this user has access to. So first thing I normally do is I would see what groups they have access to. And I know it's really hard to see, but it actually had an administrator group for a server we discovered. Once again, I will post this on YouTube, and that way you guys can clearly see it better. And we can see by using a search that there is this computer, a group associated, and a user. So if we just do the session command, we can see that the admin, the domain admin, is logged in on this box. Just by doing all this, we've done this all without triggering any alerts. A few additional features that I've just added just for Hackfest as a special release is a list functionality. So this can list out every single user, group, or computer, depending on which command you choose. List user, list group, list computer. You can also export it to a file. Oh, sorry. So with the F command, -F, you can actually pipe the contents to a file, at which point you can then use it for other types of attacks, maybe a password guessing in a secondary domain or something along the lines. I mentioned a little bit about passively pulling down file systems. File systems are always a great place. Personally, it's one of the biggest places I look for. You'd be surprised how much sensitive data, PII, social security numbers, diagrams, network diagrams, even, bat files that have domain administrator or service level accounts, credentials, and clear text. So by pulling that down, you can then see every single target and you can start profiling and looking through them, as well as looking at extracting fine-grained group policies. So fine-grained group policies are policies that are exempt from the standard domain policy for passwords. We see this a lot with companies, usually ones that are in the medical field or ones that have multiple different companies bought into them and have sister companies where there's different rules. So users can set up different reset dates based on a group or a user, or password length or complexity requirements. So with all this said, this tool, Vibe, is designed not just for red teamers, but also for blue teamers to help kind of see where these gaps are in their environment. And we can help also by combating these things. So first off, how do you stop LDAP abuse? First thing would be you have to look at monitoring the traffic between a host and your domain controllers, your LDAP server, and look at the size of the request. Is a lot of data being transferred over? Is it outside of the norm? Another thing which can be sometimes more costly is implementing firewalls to isolate these boxes off and only allowing through firewall rules certain services on certain boxes access. Next one is NetShare. So I mentioned about trying to disable before without crippling an environment. It's really hard, especially with these Windows API commands and calls. So one of the things is to really focus and narrow down the scope to understand what you're looking at. One of the things I like to tell clients is to look at requests to C $, admin $. I talked about how those are usually key indicators if you have privileges to the administrative privileges or the ability to execute code on the box, as well as any sensitive shares that might be business related. I've also seen with some success SMB-based firewalls on the actual systems. That can be sometimes more complex depending on the scale of your environment, where you write rules only allowing certain systems to access certain other systems. And it can be sometimes really hard to manage and monitor as your company grows. The next one would be NetSession. So NetSession, really easy, I said. It's really easy to detect as well, but it's also really easy to mitigate. So that registry key up there, that controls who has the ability to call this API. Windows ships by default with any user, but you can set it to either of those three: domain administrators, server users, power users, and that will prevent a large amount of abuse from this API. So this tool, this research has been an ongoing thing. It's been a passion project for mine. The next steps I'm looking at are developing more tools for both blue teams and red teams to help each other out. That will be towards looking at local domain groups, group policy abuse, other things like that. I'm always looking for more feedback information, but I've had a lot of great response from the community looking at things and what really matters to both teams. So recap. Adversaries are going to become more stealthy, living off the land, using less noisy tools, scripts, PowerShell, or even command line arguments. And as security pen testers, it's our job to match it. We train as hard as we fight. So let's look at that. Let's see what they're doing, what nation-state actors are doing. And then we can help out defense in our way. This tool Vibe is not just meant as an offensive tool, but also for defense. Posted a link. It's live on GitHub right now. Feel free to ever hit me up. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions or if you have an idea. But at this point, I'd like to take questions. No questions? Yes.
This is a technique that we have discovered. Or, you know, it's been used somewhere else.
So which technique per se? There's lots of them. So I would say I didn't create this technique. There are some ATPs out there where they do some limited stuff with LDAP. I kind of tried to push the envelope and see how far their techniques would go in the sense of how much data we could pull down before we get detected. So it comes to a lot of the research and stuff we've seen in the real world out in the wild, and then kind of pushing the boundaries for both teams. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.